Good afternoon. My name is Rob Munier, and I'm the Vice President for Marine Facilities and Operations at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, also known as WHOI. Welcome to Rising Tides, Facing the Future, and thank you all for taking the time out of your busy online schedules for another Zoom meeting. Woods Hole is a hamlet in Falmouth, Massachusetts, situated at the southwest corner of Cape Cod. Hole is a local word for channel, and Woods Hole is named for the channel, which connects Buzzards Bay and Vineyard Sound, which leads to the Atlantic Ocean. And it's known for the treacherousness due to particularly high currents during every tide cycle. Woods Hole is also the home for world-class oceanographic institutions, including WHOI, the Marine Biological Laboratory, and the Northeast Fisheries Science Center of the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. It is also a hub for marine operations with a U.S. Coast Guard base and the main port for the Steamship Authority, the ferry operator to nearby Martha's Vineyard. All this intellectual and operational horsepower is set in a quaint, quintessential New England waterfront community with a population of less than 1,000. Woods Hole is a mecca for oceanographic research, partly because of its location. Oceanographic institutions need access to the sea, and Woods Hole is perfect. A small deepwater port with nearby bays, proximity to the waters of the continental shelf, and only a day's steam and a research vessel to the Gulf Stream. The Woods Hole location is also beneficial, so compelling that WHOI, MBL, and NOAA Fisheries have been there for 90 years. For WHOI, 132 years for MBL, and 149 years for Fisheries, fulfilling their important missions to advance our understanding of the ocean. It's all about location. Much of the work done by WHOI, MBL, and NOAA Fisheries scientists is in some way connected to climate change, either as a direct research question or its impacts. So there's a certain irony that the institutions, with many of the world's experts on climate change, have critical waterfront facilities that will be impacted as sea level rises and storm impacts increase. It should come as no surprise then that in addition to leading the science, the three institutions are leading the practical response for the development of solutions for this challenging future. We have to. As evidenced by our history, our time horizons are long when it comes to mission and infrastructure, and the next 100 years will see profound change to this place. Woods Hole is a case study of what is playing out along our coasts around the country and around the world. As you would expect, Woods Hole is a well-informed case study with lessons learned that can hopefully be applied more broadly, which brings us to today's event. There are two sessions. The first is entitled Resilience Through Policy and is intended to explore the topics of climate change, sea level rise, and resiliency from the federal, state, regional, and local perspectives. The second session, A Science Community Prepares, which is this evening from 7 to 8:30, will take a deeper dive into the Woods Hole case study. For those of you who live nearby, the session will be directly relevant to your future. For those who live further afield, our goal is the Woods Hole case study is to inform and inspire action. Both sessions start with keynote remarks followed by a panel discussion. Congressman Bill Keating will open this session. Bill's district includes Southeast Massachusetts, Cape Cod, and the islands, so it is no wonder that he has a significant focus on the well-being of his constituents with a watery focus: research, fisheries, offshore wind, and tourism, balancing the blue economy with environmental stewardship. He has been our congressman since 2010 and served the state legislature for decades prior to that. Bill lives with his family on the Cape in Bourne, and he's busy today, having had to respond to congressional requirements for voting and also supporting the respects for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So his remarks are pre-recorded this morning, and we will play them for you now.
Votes on the floor or committee hearings ongoing here in DC. So let me start by congratulating and thanking Dr. Mark Abbott, who served for the last 5 years as director of the Institute and will be retiring at the end of this year. Your work has been exemplary and you will be missed. You know, we're all aware that Woods Hole is going to be undergoing between 2.5 and 4 feet of sea level rise over the next 50 years. This level of rise not only adversely affects homeowners in the community, but it'll also have impacts on the ability for research vessels to access the ocean and for the Coast Guard to fulfill their mission. Worldwide, more than 600 million people live on lands that will be directly impacted by sea level rise, and more than 2.4 billion people live within 100 kilometers of the coastline. In Massachusetts, more than 90,000 homes will be affected by sea level rise just in the next few years. As a member of the Armed Services Committee and House Foreign Affairs Committee chair of the committee that oversees global environmental issues, I've heard repeatedly about how sea level rise will affect global trade and the readiness of our armed services. A June 2020 article published by the bipartisan U.S. Naval Institute states that should 3.5 feet of sea level rise occur over the next 50 years, more than 128 U.S. military installations will be critically damaged. The Union of Concerned Scientists, a national nonprofit organization founded by MIT, performed an analysis of 18 military installations to determine the effects of sea level rise. This study's conclusion showed that because of this rise, 16 of the 18 installations could flood 100 times by the year 2050. 25% of these installations could lose up to a quarter of their land area. The Asian Development Bank has assessed the damage of sea level and what it'll have on the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, South Korea, and Indonesia, all U.S. allies in the Southeast Asian area. And that report said that it will account for more than $864 billion of damage over the next century. This not only affects our ability to trade with these partners, but also our capacity to use their port infrastructure as force protection assets for our defense. A recent European Commission study estimates that the annual damages from coastal flooding in the EU and UK could increase sharply from 1.4 billion euros today to almost 1.6 trillion euros by 2100, with 3.9 million people exposed to coastal flooding each year. Sea level rise will also cost the United States tremendously. One recent study for the Center for Climate Integrity found that the cost of replacing public infrastructure that would be impaired or destroyed by sea level rise would cost more than $7 billion on the Cape and Islands alone, and more than $400 billion nationally. Sea level rise is one of the most profound and complicated issues facing our world over the next century, and that's why we must take steps now to ensure that communities like Woods Hole and ocean research institutes like WHOI have a resilient infrastructure, an infrastructure they need to be able to continue their vital roles into the future. Woods Hole research community is a national example of how, when government and institutional researchers work together, the synergies created can change the world. The research cluster of WHOI, the Marine Biological Laboratory, NOAA, the Woods Hole Research Group, USGS, and Woods Hole create a community unlike any other in the United States and should stand as an example for the rest of the world. The ongoing work being accomplished in this community every day has already cemented southeastern Massachusetts as the test lab where we'll discover the fundamental engineering, science, and other solutions that will pave the way for communities across the globe to manage sea level rise. Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute is internationally significant as a resource for the study of oceans, climate change, and including the effects of sea level rise. It is critical, and it's important that the federal government act now to expand support for the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute and other oceanic research centers so that we can continue our critical research moving forward. It's also important for us to act and to make communities like Woods Hole more resilient. That's why I co-sponsored the Living Shorelines Act. And that's why I was pleased to see just this week that amendment was included in the Clean Economy, Jobs, and Innovation Act. It would capture 30% of the sale of offshore renewable energy leases and fold it back into NOAA's coastal resiliency grants. For Woods Hole and other ocean research institutes to be able to continue their important work, we have to recognize that their ability to access the ocean is one of the most important impacts that we have in combating sea level rise. WHOI's unsurpassed access to the world's ocean on vessels like the Neil Armstrong means that it means that researchers from across the globe will be able to utilize the vessels' floating laboratories for their own experiments. That's why it's so important to ensure that WHOI and other research institutes have the ability to safely access the oceans through resilient infrastructure that can adapt to the present and future challenges associated with this rise. That's why I'll continue to work closely with WHOI at the town of Falmouth and our partners in the Commonwealth to advance WHOI's seawater program. The seawater program will enhance the capacity of the Woods Hole research community while ensuring that access to the oceans is not limited because of sea level rise. This program is a massive undertaking, rebuilding access to piers for vessels like Neil Armstrong. The building will help to harden current facilities against climate change and create a new area of additional labs to be constructed to continue to enhance and expand the scientific ability throughout the entire community. I'd like to point out the work that Peter Hill and Joe Donovan have done working with my office to find funding for this project. And we're exploring possibilities for additional funding through both the National Defense Authorization Act and the Maritime Administration Bill. Climate change will continue to present an existential threat to the planet and to our ability to exist. Protecting facilities like ours from the effects of sea level rise will preserve an essential tool we need to understand and take action on the greater issue of climate change itself. We have our work cut out for us, but there's great promise, both in mitigating the effects of climate change and using that research as a real tool to advance a blue economy that will increase at a level of double the rest of the economy by 2035. So thank you for your work, and we'll continue to work together on these important issues.
We thank the Congressman very much for those wise remarks. He made reference to seawater, which is a project that you'll hear more about this evening in the evening session as part of the Woods Hole case study. And that stands for Complex for Waterfront Access to Exploration and Research. So we thank him for mentioning that project, and we'd love to share more about that with you at the later session. I heard a few key takeaways from the Congressman's remarks. Number one, it's pretty obvious that climate change and sea level rise are a priority of his, and that he believes the federal government has an important role to play in leading, funding, and implementing solutions, and that he really understands, appreciates, and values, and supports the important role of the Oceanographic Center of Excellence that we have here in Woods Hole, both within his district, nationally, and internationally. So we thank the Congressman again for taking the time to put those remarks together, and know that he's doing the important work on behalf of his district in Washington, D.C. today. So we're now going to switch to the panel. For those of you that are interested in posing a question to the panel, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I'd like to introduce Emiley Lockhart, who will be the moderator. Emiley is the Deputy General Counsel and Director of Regional Initiatives at WHOI, where she develops strategies to build programs with government, industry, and other key stakeholders in Massachusetts and the surrounding region. She's also responsible for the Office of Technology Transfer and assists in advancing efforts to create business opportunities for the institution. So Emiley, over to you.
Thanks, Rob, and welcome everybody. Like many coastal communities, Woods Hole, Massachusetts faces an uncertain future. Rising sea level and the potential for increased frequency and intensity of storms present significant long-term threats. As you know, Woods Hole is home to world-renowned marine science institutions performing critical research from facilities that enable access to the sea, and yet ironically are vulnerable to the same climate change impacts that are subject of study. I'd like to welcome you all to the panel discussion of resiliency through policy. We are very pleased to moderate, or I'm very pleased to moderate this afternoon's discussion, which will feature panelists Megan Braga from the Falmouth Select Board, Senator Sue Moran from the Massachusetts State Senate, Kristy Senatori from the Cape Cod Commission, and Dr. Rob Thieler from the U.S. Geological Survey. Before we get to our panelists, I just wanted to sort of help set the scene a little bit. Climate change is real. It is here. And I thought it would be useful to share a few images that we were gathering to reflect on this point, to show that it has been with us, and extreme weather has been with us for a while. If you could go to the next slide. So this is a picture of 1938 hurricanes, before I think they started naming hurricanes. This is the Woods Hole drawbridge and what's left of sort of part of the dock. Next slide. This is yet another hurricane in 1954, Hurricane Carol. This is Dyer's Dock. This is sort of the back side of Woods Hole. And you can't quite see the dock, but trust me, it's there underneath all that water. Next slide. These are the FEMA flood zones for the Falmouth area. And I know these are hard to see, but you can certainly get a sense of the creeping nature of the increased flooding that is occurring throughout this part of Cape Cod. We'll talk more about that during the panel. Next slide. And this is one of my favorite places to spend an afternoon with a glass of wine staring off in the sunset, but not that day. This is one of the king tides, I believe, that came through at the end of 2019 that flooded the back of Landfall Restaurant all the way up to my favorite chair. Thanks for the slides. And so I bring those visuals out just to remind us that we are in adaptation mode today. We're gathering data so that we can make informed choices. There are many, many worthy discussions that we should be having about the causes of climate change and what we can do to mitigate its effects. But today we want to focus on living with the inevitable and how policy will craft our future, thinking about multidisciplinary collaborative solutions that will bring us into our future, hopefully together in Woods Hole and beyond. So today we will discuss the key challenges that are facing leaders at the federal, state, regional, and local level, and how resources can best be put to use to address the multifaceted challenges associated with climate change on Cape Cod. And now let us hear from representatives at each of their level about their vision and their leadership on this important issue. I'd like to start with Dr. Rob Thieler, who is the Center Director of the U.S. Geological Survey's Woods Hole Coastal and Marine Science Center here in Woods Hole. Rob, welcome. Would love for you to maybe introduce yourself a little more fully and give us a little bit of an idea of your connection to climate resilience as we start this conversation.
Sure, thank you, Emily, and good afternoon. First, a little bit about the USGS in Woods Hole. We are one of 3 USGS science centers. The others are in St. Petersburg, Florida, and Santa Cruz, California, that comprise the USGS Coastal and Marine Hazards and Resources Program, which is a national program within the Department of the Interior. We have a staff of about 100 people here in Woods Hole. Our offices and labs are located on WHOI's Quissit campus, and our marine operations facility is on Woods Hole Road behind Wood Lumber next to the bike path. The USGS Coastal and Marine Program was authorized by Congress in 1962, and we set up shop first in Woods Hole because it's a global leader in earth and ocean sciences and marine technology. We are the federal marine geology and physical science research program responsible for our entire coastal marine landscape from estuaries to the U.S. exclusive economic zone and extended continental shelf. We have a long history of collaborative work with WHOI and the other Woods Hole science institutions, including research, ships, facilities, instrumentation, graduate students and postdoctoral researchers, diversity and educational programs, and much more. We also collaborate with other federal and state agencies, especially here in Massachusetts, which is our coastal backyard, academic institutions, and international entities, especially in the Americas, Europe, and Asia. My wife and I moved here in 1997, so by local standards, we're still newcomers, although both of our children were born in Falmouth Hospital. Prior to becoming the USGS Center Director in 2017, I led regional and national research programs on coastal change, climate, and sea level rise. I was a co-author of several of the US Global Change Research Programs, national climate assessments, and technical inputs, including the 2017 sea level rise projection report that informs planning and adaptation efforts, such as you will hear today. I've also been active in town coastal planning and served as chair of the Falmouth Coastal Resources Working Group, predecessor of today's Action Committee from 2003 to 2010. A couple key points I'd like to make today before we get into the broader panel discussion. First is that sea level rise is one of the most certain impacts of climate change, and that is because the physics of sea level rise is straightforward. When the climate warms, as it's doing today, oceans increase in volume and land-based ice melts. Recent projections suggest that sea level will rise between 1 and 11 feet by 2100. Multiple models arrive at essentially the same conclusions and have for many years. The major questions, however, are how much is it going to rise and how fast is it going to rise? And the answers to those questions depend in part on our future emissions pathways and the future behavior of large ice sheets. Coastal issues that we face today will very likely get worse and increase in extent and magnitude across our town, across our state, across the country, and across the globe. Effective adaptation to rising sea level will require changing approaches to coastal management. This is a national and global problem. At a macro scale, almost nowhere is special or unique, but where you live is certainly special and unique to you and the community in which you live. It's reasonable to expect that much of the funding for mitigation and adaptation will go to big cities. That places a premium on state and local planning to minimize the impacts and costs to life, property, the economy, and the environment. Planning activities and community conversations like this are really, really important. Finally, I'd like to say that locally, the Woods Hole science community has long participated in community discussion and actions on sea level rise. There's a lot of experience, expertise, and resources to draw on here that simply do not exist in many other places in the world. Emily?
Great. Rob, thank you so much for the comments. I'd like to next allow Senator Sue Moran to have the floor. Senator, welcome. Thank you for being here. Would love for you to be able to introduce yourself and to talk a little bit more about your role in the State House regarding climate change and maybe some of the economic development opportunities that you see, understanding that reactions to climate change and what we do in the future has many faces.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invitation. I appreciate being here in my hometown. I am the state senator for the Plymouth-Barnstable district. 5 of my 6 communities are bordered by water. I think that many of you have heard about a new digital clock in Manhattan's Union Square, the climate clock. Warning, there are 7 years, 98 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes, and 22 seconds until Earth's carbon budget is depleted based on current emission rates. A total depletion would thrust the world into further turmoil and suffering through more flooding, more wildfires, worsening famine, and extensive human displacement. The Massachusetts legislature has heard the alarm bell. WHOI, USGS, MBL, NOAA Fisheries are tremendous assets to global studies and discoveries right here in our backyard of Buzzards Bay, Nantucket Sound, Cape Cod Bay. Rising sea levels cause flooding, as Emily's picture showed, especially at our local landfall restaurant. Water is pushed further inland and into tidal estuaries, causing salt water to intrude into the coastal ecosystem, affecting our drinking water. This saltwater flooding can turn the habitats of many bird and fish species for which Massachusetts coastal wetlands provide sanctuary. Sea level rise also puts beaches and dunes at risk, which provide important nesting grounds for migratory birds and protect communities from dangerous storm surge. We've had an increase in nor'easters that have hit the area. Consequences of more extreme storm events, as well as disruptions to local economies, increase public health risks and more demands on state government and first responder capacity. Climate change impacts the economy, including tourism, agriculture, infrastructure, and financial markets. As your senator, I introduced legislation for $5 million in an act enabling partnerships for growth through the Department of Marine Fisheries Climate Change Resiliency programs. It's in Ways and Means at the moment. These grants will foster innovation for businesses working in the aquaculture sector, especially targeting ecologically oriented businesses like sustainable fisheries and firms doing CO2 mitigation. That money allows those businesses to break through certain bureaucratic walls like zoning and permitting, as well as providing for other costs that prevent those companies from becoming competitive or launching. It's going to be something really crucial as we pivot out of COVID and people are looking for new jobs. Both the Senate and the House climate bills propose net zero at 2050. The governor's already implementing certain changes, including the bills include increasing offshore wind, establishing a climate policy commission for reporting on emissions reductions, carbon pricing by 2030, energy stretch codes, low-income solar programs, displaced workers job training, and converting public buses to electric, to name a few. The good news is that the Massachusetts governor, House and Senate all agree that 2020 is the year we will address climate change with a comprehensive data and goal-oriented process. The question, especially during COVID, with the questionable federal response, will be having the fortitude to continue to invest in dedicated financial resources. And for that, we need to alert people that climate bills are economic stimulus bills. By supporting WHOI, USGS, MBL, NOAA Fisheries, we are supporting research and public-private partnerships these organizations have joined to educate about and address climate change, hopefully culminating in legislative changes that will stem the tide of the effects of climate change. Thanks, I appreciate being part of the panel today.
Senator, thank you so much. Megan, you are chair of the Falmouth Select Board, and here at Woods Hole, we have, in addition to Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, Marine Biological Lab, USGS, we also have the National Marine Fisheries Center, Science Center. We have the Sea Education Association, SEA. We have the Woodwell Climate Research Center. We've got a wonderful number of important institutions here in Falmouth. I'd love for you to introduce yourself and talk a little bit more about what you're thinking with these institutions and what is the role of local government as we're looking at climate change initiatives.
Sure. Thank you so much, Emily. And I just, in looking at the slides that you shared, we've always been adapting to living on the coastline. It's part of living where we live. Those pictures, some of them are, just shy of 100 years ago. And my family has lived here really through all of those, the no-name hurricane and Hurricane Carol. And we always had to adapt because the coastline is ever changing, even in the best of circumstances. The problem now is that the changes are really happening too fast for us to adapt without making really significant changes to the way that we are really interacting with our coastlines. And that's what makes it so different. I'm not a scientist, so I don't have any useful information like Rob shared, but I'm really here in my capacity as the chair of the Falmouth Select Board, which is the policy setting body, the primary policy setting body for the town of Falmouth. And what I'd like to discuss, what you're touching on, Emily, really is, we have a lot of resources in Falmouth, more resources than most communities can draw upon. But if we don't have good communication and we don't have good community dialogue, that doesn't really get us very far. So, I just would like to say a few words about really the role of communication, the importance of communication and trust building when we try to address the significant challenge of sea level rise and climate change. We know, policy isn't set by science. Science hopefully informs policy, but there are many factors that come into public policy, not the least of which is, what is the buy-in from the stakeholders? We are talking about when we look at the way that we can respond to climate change and sea level rise, None of the answers are inexpensive. None of the answers are easy. And we have to bring the community along with us. If we don't, you know, we're talking about projects that are significant. They're going to require substantial financial investment, really tough decisions. These are decisions that are going to impact folks' personal property, their enjoyment of the community in which they have maybe lived for generations, or have staked all of their funds that they've earned their lives to retire to. And it will certainly impact their perceived or even their real enjoyment of where they live and their standard of living. So they're not decisions that are easily made, and we can't guarantee a win-win. The reality is that, you know, frankly, there are going to be folks who suffer significantly, regardless of which policies we choose. If we choose to do nothing at all, we know that sea level rise is going to greatly impact a number of individuals within our community. We know that the choices that are in front of us have significant impacts, or will, on individuals and parts of our community. So we really need to have you know, an impactful, effective response. And the challenge to that, first and foremost, is having the community be part of that dialogue. If we nurture that relationship between sort of the folks who are making decisions and the community, it will really help inform that policy and ultimately, hopefully, make it most successful. So the work that I see our board doing, frankly, in collaboration with many of the organizations and with the assistance of many of the organizations that, that you laid out, that we are very fortunate to have sort of right in our backyard. The work I see us doing is laying that foundation, and really through transparency, through open communication, to have the public be part of our discussion about coastal resiliency. In fact, why we created, this board created, when Sue was actually on it, the Coastal Resiliency Action Committee. And we made it a committee that's appointed by the select board. And we did that for a very specific reason. We really wanted that board to have, when it's appointed by us, it has to have an agenda, public meetings, keep minutes, have the ability for the public to make public comment on what they're doing. And there was a reason for that. You know, we can have the best data, we can have the most, you know, sort of creative or innovative response. And if the public isn't willing to buy into it, we're not going to get anywhere. And I think the role of the select board in Falmouth really is to drive that ongoing discussion. You know, we've had 3 very public presentations in the last few years. The first was the workshop to prepare us for the Massachusetts Vulnerability Assessment. That was something we had a lot of feedback on. We also had the assessment that was done on town assets, and that was very shocking, I think, for folks to see some of the predicted impacts of sea level rise. And then obviously the most recent was the study of Surf Drive, which was presented just about a week ago. All of those were aided by the Woods Hole group and some of the really great work that they did to, you know, have the data, but more importantly, translate that data into a presentation that a layperson like myself could sit down and understand and take a look at. These are all really well attended presentations, and we've continued to receive significant feedback about them. So, you know, I think good science is helpful, but also good community relations are what bring projects to fruition. So, you know, just to speak a little bit about the way that this select board is approaching this challenge, we will be having a report from the Coastal Resiliency Action Committee coming before the board towards the end of this year. And from there, there'll continue to be ongoing discussion about which recommendations are appropriate. We know that there isn't one size, you know, one size fits all response to the challenges. Our coastline is very disparate. There are challenges at Minot Beach that we don't face at, say, Chappaquiddick Beach. Each part of our coastline has a different challenge, and we will need many different interventions. And those interventions, you know, run the gamut of some that can be fairly simple to others that are going to be quite significant. And so, you know, we continue to rely on science. and at the same time really make sure that we are engaging with the residents here in Falmouth, so that we can, when we finally make a recommendation, there is some trust there that the data is accurate, that the proposed intervention is the best with all things considered, because the public has been there throughout the conversation. And that's something that this board is very much committed to.
Megan, thank you. I think that your points on communication are so right. And I think you've really gotten to sort of two different layers of communication. Communication within the community, making sure that we are able to really have a good relationship and be with each other, but also communicating the science into English, right? So taking those, all that data and translating into something that is usable, that's actionable, that you can build policy with. I hope we'll get to that and continue that conversation throughout this afternoon. I'd like to next introduce Kristy Senatori, last but not least, to the panel. And Kristy, as Executive Director of the Cape Cod Commission, which is doing so much and is a bridge between federal and state and local work, I'd love for you to maybe speak a little bit more about yourself, and also what is the Commission doing and looking at as we face climate change.
Thanks, Emily. And thank you very much for the opportunity to be a part of this panel today. The Cape Cod Commission is the regional planning agency for the region. We're charged with protecting the unique values and quality of life on Cape Cod. But more importantly, we're charged with balancing the quality of our shared environment with sustainable economic progress. Through thoughtful and collaborative planning, we work to build more resilient communities that are capable of withstanding the effects of climate change today and minimizing its impacts in the future here on Cape Cod. Climate change and climate resiliency has been built into the Commission's work since its beginning, really since 1990. It's one of my regional priorities as Executive Director for the agency, and it continues to be a major component of our most recently updated plans. And for example, our 2018 Regional Policy Plan identified climate change as one of the key challenges faced in the region. It includes goals and objectives, strategies and planning actions that are charged with improving our resilience to climate change. One of the main recommendations in that regional policy plan is the establishment of a region-wide greenhouse gas emissions inventory. It's critical that we set the baseline for our emissions so that we can measure our performance into the future in reaching our regional reduction goals. We are well underway and hopefully very shortly near completion of that greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And not surprising to find that the emissions from the transportation sector are one of the highest at just over about 55% of our total emissions. Which leads me to our next regional plan that really takes a look at climate change, and that's our Cape Cod Regional Transportation Plan. And this plan, also recently updated, includes a lot of data and information on climate change impacts, but it also encourages strategies that result in fewer vehicle miles traveled. It prioritizes projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and it also recommends significant funding for climate change related work. And then the third plan I wanted to highlight as a regional plan addressing climate is our comprehensive economic development strategy, which was also recently updated and approved by the Federal Economic Development Administration. This also includes many climate resiliency actions, and incorporation of these actions into the plan that was approved by the federal EDA really paves the way for potential additional opportunities for funding that can be brought into the region to help us address climate change, not only adaptation strategies, but mitigation strategies as well. So one of those actual opportunities I'll speak to in just a moment here. But kind of switching gears a bit, in 2016, the Cape Cod Commission was awarded a competitive grant. It's a regional coastal resiliency grant through the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, through NOAA, to develop a series of resources to assist the communities on Cape Cod in making some of those difficult decisions related to coastal impacts and resiliency. So we worked with a number of partners, federal, state, and local partners, And more importantly, we worked with a lot of stakeholders across the region, and the 3 previous speakers really emphasized the need for community engagement, and I certainly echo their sentiments. Engaging stakeholders from across the region really helped us to develop an adaptation strategies matrix and develop strategies that our communities can embrace as we look to support our response to climate change. So amongst several of the resources that were developed as part of this project was the Cape Cod Coastal Planner. We developed a decision support tool that really was intended to take a significant amount of complex data and make it available to an average citizen, an average stakeholder that wants to understand the impacts to their region. So it's a planning tool that allows a user to better understand its vulnerabilities and apply strategies to specific geographic areas. And then they can compare the potential impacts of those strategies to each other and also to a potential no action scenario. If we were to do nothing as a region, what would that look like in terms of the environment and the economy? So I do have a couple of slides I'm happy to share. So one powerful aspect of the tool is that it does take a significant number of data layers that are necessary for decision making, and it makes them accessible in one location. So what you're seeing here is a new data layer called our vulnerability ribbon. So this allows users to better understand relative vulnerabilities of various segments of shoreline. This screenshot shows an area obviously in South Falmouth, and the ribbon that we created was using the South Carolina Beachfront Vulnerability Index as a model, and it looks at infrastructure and natural resources proximate to the shoreline. It projects climate hazards and other variables to identify the segments that are most vulnerable. On the next slide, for those that want to look in detail at one particular vulnerability, such as flooding, they can view the FEMA flood zones along any segment of shoreline. And then lastly, users can also review other layers in the next slide, such as the slosh zones, for example, the sea lake and overland surge from hurricane zones. And all of the protected climate hazards can be viewed along with other critical data layers, such as structures, municipal properties, roads, and other infrastructure, such as sewer and coastal defense structures. So that's the climate, that's our Cape Cod Coastal Planner tool, our application. And the last piece of work I just wanted to highlight is our Resiliency and Climate Initiative. And we recently applied for, and this spring were awarded $1 million competitive EDA disaster relief grant for our Cape Cod Resiliency Initiative. And so what this project is, it's helping the communities to identify approaches and develop implementation strategies to ensure that some of the impacts to the businesses, communities, and natural resources created by some of our region's most critical challenges can be managed and minimized. So there are multiple components to this project, including a significant amount of data collection, analysis and assessment, stakeholder engagement and outreach, looking at some of the local and regional land use planning and regulations, and determining where there may be opportunities to support our communities in managing development in the floodplain and developing potential model coastal resilience bylaws. And then the last part is the decision support tools and resources, and building on the work that we did with our Coastal Planner application, we'll be able to add some functionality to that tool. And also, I develop a strategy to convey and track some of the progress towards reaching some of our greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. So as part of this overall resiliency initiative, much of the work is geared towards our Cape Cod Climate Initiative, and we're well underway with the development of a climate action plan for the region. I mentioned the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, which is really critical to establishing the baseline for the region. We began our stakeholder outreach last fall with several sub-regional community meetings. We really wanted to hear from stakeholders about how climate change planning and action should be structured, who should be engaged, and what kind of outcomes the communities would like to see as a result of the process. We're continuing our work with stakeholder engagement in our climate initiative and the climate action plan, and our call for stakeholders and organizations is out, and I would certainly encourage anyone who's interested in participating to visit our website. So I look forward to the panel discussion, and I want to thank Emily and WHOI for hosting this session, and I look forward to hopefully answering some questions.
Oh, that's great. Kristy, thank you so much. I think your Coastal Planner application that you were showing us, continues to demonstrate taking that data and really being able to make it useful as a communication tool to anybody who wants to look at it. It seems, really user-friendly, and I appreciate you sharing that particularly with us. Just a housekeeping item for our participants. Just remember, if you have any questions that you would like to ask our panelists, if you just write them into the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen. We've got several questions coming in. And so I'd like to start maybe with a question that might be directed mostly at Rob Thieler, maybe also to Kristy, concerning sort of sea level rise and what we've seen in the past. Wondering what kind of historical events we've seen that have sort of moved us to confront this issue as we look at maybe what things have looked like more over the past 100 years or so. And I suppose as a second side of that question, besides what have we seen into the past, is if we were to sort of stop the bad activity, the greenhouse gas emission activity tomorrow, what are the effects that are sort of inevitable at this point? How much planning just needs to happen just if we, if all the greenhouse gases were turned off tomorrow? So maybe Rob and Kristy, you could take a whack at that.
Sure. With respect to what would happen if the entire world stopped its greenhouse gas emissions tonight or tomorrow, there are a number of effects that are what people often call as baked in or commitments. And one of those commitments is the sea level rise, because the current temperature of the atmosphere is not in equilibrium with the ocean. So there's still heat exchange and warming that's going to go on in the ocean. So even if we stopped greenhouse gas emissions today, there is a commitment to future sea level rise that extends out over a century and beyond. Sea level will continue to rise. It's baked in, but that will be obviously at a lower rate because the forcing of the system, the emissions of greenhouse gases are reduced, or in that scenario, turned off.
Great, thank you. Kristy, anything to add there?
Well, we know that we have about 586 miles of vulnerable tidal shoreline, and it's already at risk to flooding and erosion. We know sea level rise and climate change will further exacerbate these challenges, as well as impact how our ecosystems are functioning. But I think it's important to recognize too the economic realities of how our history has shaped where we are today. Under existing conditions, flooding threatens more than about 19% of the region's land area. That actually comprises about 13,000 single-family homes, about 1,500 inventoried historic structures, and about 30% of the town's identified critical facilities. And it's about 1,400 businesses are located within the floodplain area. So even more importantly, this area has a combined assessed value of more than $16 billion. So I think it's critical to look at not only the historical events that have moved us where we are today, in terms of sunny day flooding and hurricanes, but also to make sure that we're recognizing the economic impacts of our actions that we've been taking historically and our actions that we take into the future.
Great, thank you. For Senator Moran and Megan, the question has come in to ask a little bit more about some of the policy or action plans that you have been describing. And if there are examples of ones that you feel that would help mitigate our intensifying climate, if there are some additional policies or some specifics you'd like to share, I'll let Senator Moran maybe go first and then have Megan go next.
So when you look at climate change policies, and we, as I said in my introduction, we are moving forward with programs to reduce emissions, and it's a matter of, how do we go about doing that? Is it a carbon tax, or, that's always something that's a difficult conversation. But as those conversations occur, I think we really have to reach out. It's about, there still is an argument in some circles about the existence of climate change. And I think it's really our responsibility to continue to do the education and outreach. And it's not a hoax. We look at the data and to really start a two-prong approach, which Megan, I'm sure, will speak more to this, but when the Climate Action Committee was started in the precursor work done by Rob Thieler, we looked at, how do we prepare the community for some changes? How do we prepare the community for the fact that some roads in Falmouth might be overtaken by the sea within so many years? The maps that Kristy was showing, the pictorials, that sort of information, making it available to the public is huge. And Falmouth has taken a real two-prong approach. One is to deal with and ask the community where they want to spend their tax money in terms of mitigation of climate change, and then to look at behaviors like retreat, be sort of make it part of the dinner conversation, the education, the school conversation. I think those are the things we have to do right now.
Yeah, I agree with Sue. I think, at the local level, we can certainly implement townwide policy. How far that gets us in terms, if we're just talking about trying to mitigate climate change, at the town level, we're a little bit constrained in terms of, some of the impacts that we can make. We're lucky to live in a state and in a region where I think, governors and legislators really at the state level, regional level, believe that there needs to be a concerted effort to address, the issue of climate change and sea level rise. So for us at the town level, it really is more about our response to and our adaptation to sea level rise, rather than what are the big policies that we can put in place to lower our carbon footprint. Although, certainly there are things that we can do. We have a bit of a harrowing history when we talk about renewable energy in Falmouth with the situation with the turbines. So I think sometimes people are a bit, they feel a bit shy about doing those big steps. I mean, Falmouth really was on the forefront of trying to look at community, changeover to renewable and sort of less carbon producing energy sources. We've taken a step back because that didn't go the way that many of us hoped it would. But we do still have, we're doing things at the town level, switching over to more electric vehicles with our town fleet. Looking at town meeting, just this last town meeting passed a ban on single-use water bottles. Again, as a reflection of trying to reduce sort of globally, the impact of what happens in terms of producing those types of plastics, where they go. So there are some things that sort of look large level at climate change and sea level rise. But for us, it's really the select board, town meeting members, we really are looking more at how do we adapt? How do we respond to what the challenges that are coming our way? And those are, where we're at in that process is really to say everything's on the table right now, because we are talking about, and anybody who's sort of followed the presentations that Coastal Resiliency Action Committee has put forward understands that some of the recommendations might be to really retreat and abandon particular roads. That has an impact on personal property. That's not going to be an easy policy to push through. There are going to be legal components of this as we go forward. There'll be some choices that will be out of our hands if we were to have a significant storm. Just like we had to move the road back near Minot Beach, there's nowhere to move some of our roads back anymore. There's infrastructure like sewering that's underneath some of those vulnerable places, like the bike path, the Shining Sea bike path. So the piece for the local level is really how do we protect our assets in a way that, again, the public can get behind to support. It's never going to be 100% because there are going to be some folks who are going to say, this is my home. It's the most meaningful piece of property I own. It's the culmination of all of my life's work. And you're telling me that you're no longer going to, as a community, I pay taxes on it, that you're no longer going to protect the infrastructure that protects my home. Those are going to be hard conversations. So I think at the local level, It's less about how are we setting policy that reduces the, sort of reduces the likelihood or I should say the time frame of sea level rise, but really more about policies that respond to it. And that is going to take collaboration at the regional level. This is a discussion that every community on Cape Cod is having. So, that is where we are at. And again, it's a big discussion and we have a lot of options in front of us, and that's what we'll be, thinking about as we go forward.
Thank you, Megan. And I have sort of a follow-up question from the audience that I would like to put up to Rob and Kristy and Sue and you, which is, just following from what you were saying, Megan, is what types of climate mitigation approaches should Cape Cod adopt to reduce greenhouse gas emission at the town, the local, the county, the state level, understanding that there is enough that's baked in that we're not gonna be able to stop sea level rise, but what can we do for the future? And you listed off already a couple of great things that are happening, Megan, but I'd like to let the rest of the panelists sort of chime in here for ideas that they would, recommend looking into or thinking about. Rob, how about you?
Sure.
Well, sure. Certainly, well, first thing to remember is that the USGS does policy relevant but policy neutral research about this. And as a federal scientist, I don't take a position either way on policy choices. Our work helps inform those policy choices in ways that Senator Moran and Representative Keating discussed. A lot of work done in Massachusetts and locally runs the gamut. The presentation on Surf Drive last week was, I think, a really good illustration of the kinds of options and things that need to be discussed in a community conversation about where are you going to hold the line? What are the consequences? What are the potential costs? How long do these mitigation and adaptation measures need to last? Do you need to survive through the next storm? Do you need to survive for a certain elevation of sea level, or do you need to survive forever? And those things vary depending on whether you have a dock, a roadway, a bike path, or other critical infrastructure, or need to provide emergency services in ways that you didn't previously, because road access becomes something that changes over time. So it's really great to see the town of Falmouth and the Cape engage in this really rich dialogue about potential options, because they all need to be vetted and evaluated against impacts on life, property, the environment, and the economy.
Rob, thank you. Senator Moran, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I think you may wanted to add a comment or two.
Sure, just something that Kristy said really struck me, and I've got some background in working with the commission and in the stellar work and methodical work that they do, and when you talk about 50% coming from automobiles, if I heard that right, it seems to me, we really need to, we've got a lot of work to catch up on. We've got to move quickly to try to stem the tide of the effects of climate change. And so I think, getting credits to employers who promote working at home. I mean, that takes a lot of cars off the road. And there is great movement lately on electric vehicles. I think that that not only is a great pivot job source, but I think that, we can certainly put some stimulus funds into making more reliable electric cars, more available, less expensive electric cars. And those were, just two reflexive things that I thought about when Kristy made her report.
All right, excellent. That's exactly right. And actually, Kristy, I have a follow-up question from the audience going to the coastal planning tool that you had highlighted. And the question is if the Cape Cod Coastal Planning tool is available to the public online. And I think the answer is yes, but if you want to talk just for a minute about that tool, and if there are, you have, the Cape Cod Commission has done a great job for this tool for our area. If there are similar tools that you're aware of in other areas, it's another question we had.
Sure, those are actually really great questions. And when we developed this coastal planner tool for our region, we did a lot of research across the world, but really focused on the United States and similar locales. And there are other similar tools out there. This one is significantly tailored to Cape Cod, and we took a lot of local data that we were able to capture and make sure that it was available in this tool. And it is available on our website as well as our climate website as well. So anybody who's interested in taking a look at all the different components that went into the coastal planning tool, including the adaptation strategies matrix, which includes a lot of these different strategies that are being discussed today. Each one is accompanied by a fact sheet that includes detailed information about the costs for construction. It looks at some of the environmental economics that are associated with each of the applications and strategies as well. So it's all available on our website, capecodcommission.org. Those are great questions, and we look forward to making updates to the tools and the applications as we move forward with our climate and resiliency initiatives as well.
That's great. Thank you, Kristy. Next question that I have, I'm not sure which panelist wants to take a go at this one. It's a question about sort of the retreat. So understanding that sea level rise is on the rise, and there are, from the surf drive presentation from last week to other notions of how do we adapt to the inevitable. The question is whether the town is considering retreating from the shore or changing zoning laws to stop construction along the coast, if people will have to abandon their homes, and if there are plans for alternative sites or funding assistance. It is a tough topic. It is something that I think, we can all say there are no firm answers here, but I think it's a really interesting question as to how to address that. And so I'd like to open that up to anybody who's brave enough to give it a go on this. Megan.
I'll
Yes.
speak to it just because it's so, sort of specifically, I think, really triggered by the presentation about Surf Drive. And the first thing I would say is, this is not a situation where we're trying to pit folks who are concerned about climate change and sea level rise with folks who want to stay in their home that they love. We can hold those two groups of people in the same conversation. We understand that you can believe 100% in doing what's right for the planet, for the climate, for your community, and also be incredibly nervous and frightened and angry and upset about how it might impact your sort of particular corner of the world. That is, those two things don't have to be at odds, and they're not going to be able to be at odds if we want to have sound policy. So what I would say in response to that particular question is that we are in really the beginning stages of this discussion. We've conducted, town meeting gave money to have this research and this data collected and these analyses done because town meeting, the select board, this community really believes that we have to get the information and the science and the data in front of us and have that be sound so that we can make decisions based on that. So everything is on the table because we haven't finished the conversation. It's really in its infancy. There are tools available to communities in terms of, again, if there are situations where we are going to have to abandon certain roads and that impacts certain properties, that will have to be addressed. Do we have some special fund to address this? No, we don't have sort of a pool of money that's sitting there right now to purchase homes from individuals or to compensate individuals if their property is going to be impacted. There's been discussion about whether or not it's appropriate to have some type of, the way we do for other kind of emergency funds. Do we start to fund a climate change, a coastal resiliency or climate change adaptation mitigation fund? There's been talk about that, and that would really be something that would be, done at the town meeting level. Some of the numbers are overwhelming, so the idea of putting $1 million into a fund seems like a drop in the bucket for what ultimately we would need. But specifically to that question, everything's on the table because the conversation is new. and it's just starting because the data is just being really gathered and in a form that we can present it. And the reason why we're presenting it in this way, and we know it generated a lot of, we've received as a select board, a lot of feedback about the surf drive presentation. Some of it saying, I don't believe the data, I don't believe the numbers, I think it's the danger or the sort of level of risk is inflated. Others saying, you know, how are we going to put $1 more into doing anything on surf drive in the surf drive area if this is what's ahead of us? So we're going to take that feedback. We're going to continue that conversation. The reality is every option and every response is on the table because every response is going to be needed in certain parts of our town. There are places that will need retreat. There are places that will need abandonment. Maybe not next year, maybe not for 20 years, but we know the march of sea level rise is going to mean very particular things for our community. And we need to be ready to have an honest discussion about that, to plan as much as we can. You know, some things we can't plan for. We don't, you know, as I noted, if we have a significant weather event, it can change this conversation tomorrow. There may be decisions that are taken out of our control because, you know, we have a very significant event that changes our coastline. Everything's on the table because that's the way you make good policy. You know, we're not going to sort of really limit our options before we've even had the full dialogue. And so that's really where we're at. There are no specific plans. None of that would happen without, you know, real community conversation, a vote by town meeting. I mean, these are things that wouldn't happen under the radar. Everyone would know what was being discussed and what might sort of be a policy going forward.
Great, thank you. Rob, would you like to chime in on that too?
Sure, just to point out that, you know, these kinds of discussions and actions are happening nationally now, today, every day. You know, buildings are being moved, plans are being made to restructure critical infrastructure and move communities out of harm's way. One of the things that has been shown, especially in response to the hurricanes of the last couple of decades, is that while severe storms create an opportunity to retreat, quite often it forces your hand, and communities are not prepared to deal with that eventuality. So it gets messy and it gets really expensive. And having a proactive plan that includes an acknowledgement of the role of storms in creating challenges or opportunities to a managed retreat is really important. It's also, I see a question in the queue about different forms of retreat, such as buffered retreat, and how to integrate that with sediment management. Certainly that's a critical part of what Falmouth will have to do. You know, we know from the data that the Coastal Resources Working Group and others have produced over the years that some of the erosion problems in different parts of town are caused by the hard stabilization that was put in place 60, 80 years ago when we didn't really know that that was going to be such an extreme impact. And undoing that requires understanding certain trade-offs. You know, is it more important to introduce sediment by doing that, or is it more important to preserve the infrastructure and activities behind it? But again, that's part of the discussion and the trade-offs that we're going to need to make as a town in deciding how and where to implement what kinds of adaptation strategies.
That's a great point. Thank you. And I think also the evening panel will focus on some of this as well, especially for WHOI and you know, thinking about future planning and how to, you know, what structurally and infrastructure wise can you do, you know, to recognize that sea level rise is real, it's coming, but you know, we still want to have things like access to the sea. And so I think that'll be a good conversation to continue having this evening. A question that I see is moving a slightly different way, but sort of back to the maybe mitigation question a bit, which was that we'd spoken about greenhouse gases and you know, things, policies and programs to think about how to cut those. And the question is, what is the priority rank of marine pollution research and mitigation program in climate resilience study? And so I think the idea is just, you know, in addition to the greenhouse gas things that we've been discussing, the marine pollution and what's affecting our sea. This is a seaside community, if there ever was one. Are there some ideas, efforts, and policies that we should be thinking about in that domain as well? And I think I'll open that up to any of the panelists, but I don't know if Senator Moran, if you want to maybe start off with anything that you've been thinking about specifically, and maybe also as we're thinking about the ocean, not only in terms of mitigation, but are there opportunities, economic opportunities or otherwise, that we should be focusing on?
Sure. So taking off on the last question, I mean, in a sense, we've done this before. We have we kind of have a track record when you look at the water quality sort of mitigation that the Cape has been undergoing in a real ongoing sense. The difference being that work was sort of delayed until it had gotten to a high problem level. So, I really have to commend Falmouth in their efforts to really get in front of this so early, so that there is time to look at many different options. There is time to look at funding. There is time to make a plan, and we're very lucky to be, in the center of a whole bunch of scientific organizations, so we can get the best minds on the job as soon as possible. When you look at the ocean itself, another local example, the Island Queen has been publicizing just a little experiment of collecting, just what's in the ocean when right where they're working. And I think to me that's really meaningful, because it makes the conversation part of everyone's everyday. And again, back to that awareness and education piece, so that there's enough investment in recognition about how important it is. So that's the thing that I would focus on right away.
Great, thank you. Kristy, I'd love to hear from you.
Sure, and just kind of echoing what Senator Moran was saying, it's really important for us to understand the impacts and more broadly have the educational tools and the educational components of the planning process. And our coastal planning process really looked a lot at the impacts of storm surge and sea level rise and erosion, and all of the strategies, the adaptation strategies, are focused on those areas. And so you can decide which strategy you want to have and implement, and which would have the greatest impact. And I think more research and modeling will certainly help us to better understand our risks as a result of climate change conditions. We'll know how better to estimate impacts from flooding and storm surge and erosion and other coastal hazards. We have the best ocean institutions in the world right here on Cape Cod, so I have no doubt that we'll continue to have the best available information. But kind of pivoting on what Emily had mentioned, we can use our geographic ocean resource as an opportunity too, and better understanding some of the ocean carbon sequestration from a global perspective will aid in identifying opportunities to sequester greenhouse gas emissions locally. So I think there's a great opportunity given the geographic location that we have, and it's a good way for us to take advantage of our economy and our environment here on the Cape.
Great, thank you. And I think we just have time for one last question, which is just to follow up what Kristy was just saying, and as we talk about the ocean research institutions that are here, how does ocean research play into your planning processes? And so this maybe sort of goes back to what Megan was talking about earlier in the panel discussion too, thinking about that communication between science and policy. But maybe if each of you would just take a moment as we finish up here, just to respond to that and what you feel like we can do at Woods Hole Oceanographic, and of course with all the other institutions that are here, and how we can help in your policy planning purposes. Rob, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I think it's obvious from this conversation and the institutions that we're talking about here in Woods Hole that ocean research is critical to apply globally to understand the distribution and magnitude of climate change impacts that affect the environment, people, the economy. This is a really broad suite of things. from ocean warming and acidification to ocean life and productivity to the distribution of animal, mineral, and other resources which we rely on for the world oceans to provide. It's also critical to apply locally this kind of research to understand how fast are things changing. What thermometers are we going to use? Is it the position of the shoreline? Is it the frequency of nuisance flooding? Those kinds of things. Why are they changing? And use that information to inform time triggers or event triggers or change triggers, including like what was proposed for Surf Drive to ultimately implement a managed retreat that is thoughtful and sensible and has time to address a number of the issues that we've discussed in this panel. There are economic issues, there are social justice issues, both here and in other communities around the state and around the country that we need to be informed about and sensitive to. And ocean research plays a critical role in all of that.
Great, thanks, Rob. And Megan, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I'll just jump in briefly and say, 100% agree with all the points that Rob made. I think, the beautiful thing about having Woods Hole as part of Falmouth is that every single person who works in any of the institutions we've talked about is a stakeholder in the community that they are helping to create responses to climate change and sea level rise for. So it is not a disconnected or impersonal process. The folks at WHOI and all of the other assets in Woods Hole are our neighbors, our family members, and what happens to our coastline and how we adapt, is very meaningful to them. And sort of on the other side of that, Woods Hole isn't this far off research facility for the rest of the folks in Falmouth. It is part of our community. So there's a level of goodwill and trust because these folks that are really sharing this data, coming up with these possible solutions, are people that are part of the fabric of our town. Woods Hole is a generator of innovation. It always has been. It's a place that is an incubator for ideas. And that is an enormous asset. And from a perspective of someone who helps to set policy for the town of Falmouth, I'll be candid, we rely very heavily on the research institutions in Woods Hole for all of the reasons. I mean, the high level of credibility, really the history of their work and the quality of it. And again, that fact that they are part of our community, a very significant part. So I think that partnership is ongoing, and there's no way that you can sort of unweave that thread. Falmouth and Woods Hole and the Woods Hole institutions, looking at these issues are part and are going to be partners in our response as we go forward.
Megan, thank you very much. Very powerful words. And I think, the partnership is real, and it is we work here, we live here, we play here. This is an incredible town to be in. And I hope that we get to continue this collaborative relationship for, many years to come. I want to thank everyone for your time today. For the panelists, thank you for bringing your thoughts, your expertise. It was just wonderful to hear your voices. Thank you to our audience. I'm sorry that we weren't able to answer some of the wonderful questions out there, but really appreciate your participation and listening. I'd like to thank the Massachusetts Seaport Economic Council, and also a big thank you to the Woods Hole Oceanographic staff who's been working behind the scenes to make this discussion possible today. Michelle Statz, Matt Barton, Riley Orlando, Craig LaPlante, many others. They make it look easy. We all know better, and I'd like to thank them very much for their time. And now hand the mic back to Rob to close us out. Rob.
Thanks a lot, Emily. That was really an enlightening and informative discussion. So thanks to the panel. And you said some of the thanks that I was going to say, so I won't repeat them. I do want to make a point that there is a partnership, a couple partnerships that are worth mentioning. One is between Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, Marine Biological Laboratory, and Northeast Fisheries branch of NOAA. We've gotten together to really look at Woods Hole in the same fashion that Falmouth has looked at other parts of the town of Falmouth. And that's going to be part of the topic that we'll be discussing tonight. And it served as a good case study for how you might approach it. And obviously we have the benefit of these wonderful institutions all on the same street, aptly called Water Street. And so that partnership is really a part of why this event has taken place. I also want to mention, Emily mentioned the Seaport Economic Council. We received a grant from them that helped fund some of this. And in partnership, we have that grant in partnership with the town of Falmouth. So these partnerships are real and they're really important. And I think it speaks to some of the points that we just heard in the panel. And probably the most important one being about the notion of communication and community engagement and the need for this to be an ongoing dialogue. And obviously, Falmouth is very fortunate in the wonderful resources it has at all levels. I think another key takeaway I heard today, thanks Rob for saying it so eloquently and shortly, and that was that sea level rise is happening and it's accelerating. So this is something that we have to deal with, and this town is doing that. It's also become a near-term problem, so that the time for action is now. And we have to do this in a good and measured way. And I think that's how things are starting here in town. And also that leadership is needed at all levels of government. And I think it's very evident from this panel that we have that in our midst. And we're very fortunate that this is a very enlightened community. So I do want to encourage everybody to attend the session this evening. It starts at 7 o'clock, and we'll do this deep dive into take a close look at the hamlet of Woods Hole and how the community is going to approach that. And we have some solutions. So it's not just all about the problems, it's about some ideas for solutions and how to manage this going forward in a good way. So thanks a lot for attending and everybody's participation today, and we'll see you at 7. Thank you.